All right. So we are on, and we are at Lorraine and Poussin. So if you remember last time, we made it through Bernini. So if you don't remember him, you can go back and look at that lecture. So Claude and Poussin, we basically go by this guy's first name and this guy's last name. And they are a little ahead of their time. They basically did paintings in the style that we would classify as neoclassical, which we'll get to eventually. But they were primarily considered to be landscape painters. And the most famous painting of theirs is one by Poussin called Et in Arcadia Ego. And those of you who were with us yesterday got to hear all about this painting, but the people in period G haven't seen this, so I'm going to explain it to them, and you guys can just follow along. So this is a painting set in a place called Arcadia, which according to the ancient Greeks was this perfect pastoral kind of paradise of simple farmers. Nothing would trouble them. They didn't have to deal with all of the modern day problems like traffic and when your phone is not charged or whatever. And the title of this painting is Et in Arcadia Ego, which means I am also in Arcadia. And in this painting, these group of simple ideal peasants have come across this tomb, and they're looking at it and wondering, what is this? And the idea is that, yes, even in this paradise, there is still death. And if we look at the way the painting is constructed, which is very much in what we will call the neoclassical style later on, you have a lot of horizontals and a lot of verticals. And the tomb is on a straight horizontal line. As your eye is brought in, you are sort of slowed down by these different lines, and your eye sort of travels across. This guy's pointing here, this guy's pointing here, this lady is standing very tall and straight and is reflected in trees. And so this gives you sort of a contemplative mood. It's nothing fast and exciting happening. And the model that Poussin used for these, you can tell these guys are kind of based on your ancient Greek sculptures that we looked at. They have a bit more clothes on, but they're actually wearing their clothes. When we get to Rubens later on, we'll see that his characters had a lot of clothes and weren't necessarily wearing them. And these people are kind of posed. So look at this lady. This will be one of the characteristics of the neoclassical when we get to it, that they're standing there like they're posed like an ancient Greek statue. So here's another Poussin. And in that time, you had various levels of how important a type of painting was. So for example, you have the highest form of painting was paintings that told a historical or biblical story. So if you have a painting of Moses parting the Red Sea, that would be a high painting. Down near the bottom, we're painting of landscapes. It's kind of like there's just a background for, there's nothing going on. So that would be sort of at the bottom of the list of desirability. And Poussin loved to do landscapes. And in this case, he's added a little story here. This is Phocion this is an ancient Greek story about a guy who was a traitor and got killed and was sentenced to be buried outside the city, et cetera, et cetera. And the story itself is just a tiny part of the picture. In reality, this is a nice landscape scene. But notice again, the concentration on horizontal and vertical lines. So you have this strong horizontal going here where you have the city. Probably the first thing your eye is attracted to is this. And then you follow along, and then you notice there's a road that sort of goes back and forth across the horizontals and eventually leads you past all these little pastoral scenes to the people who are in the front. And so this is, again, characteristics of what we will look at in the neoclassical. But these guys were working, 100 years or so before their time. And this is a painting by Claude, and similar style, basically a landscape. And you had, the story here is the Queen of Sheba, who is this little character, actually this little character here, who is getting back on her ship. So she's getting into the boat, and it's going to take her out to probably this ship, since it's the coolest one there. But the actual topic is really tiny. So the Queen of Sheba is hardly an important part of this painting. So Claude later on said, yes, I charge for the landscape and I throw the figures in for free. Here's another example of his. This one up here is titled The Marriage of Jacob and Rebecca. And Jacob and Rebecca aren't even in this painting. The only reference to them is that their names are carved on a tree stump somewhere over in this area here that you can't really see on the PowerPoint. But down here, we have one of my favorite artists, a guy by the name of Turner, who we'll come to later, who's in the Romantic, which is the last period that we're going to look at. And he painted, inspired by these paintings from these precocious Baroque people. He inspired these paintings and donated them to the country on the condition that they be always displayed next to these other two by Claude. Because he said, he's the one who inspired me, so I want to have these paintings, which talk about the founding of Carthage and the fall of Carthage. I want them to be displayed prominently with Claude. So next two people, if you find them on your notes here, Hals and Leicester, very similar, so we've kind of grouped them together. And these guys are truly Baroque. So we've now moved up into the Northern Baroque. We're getting away from the Catholic influenced, the idea of the Baroque bringing people back to make the church interesting. So these guys here are now up in primarily Protestant Northern Europe, although at this point, Flanders, which would be eventually Belgium, was basically Catholic. The Netherlands was basically Protestant. And this is a piece by Hals, probably his most famous one. It's called The Laughing Cavalier. And you'll notice you have the strong light coming in from the side. You have the shadow here, not overly much chiaroscuro. You're seeing a lot of detail on this person. So the lighting isn't overly stark in this way, but actually look at the guy's mouth. So put your finger over his mustache and notice that he's not actually even smiling, let alone laughing. It's all mustache, which is, quite impressive. If you can grow a mustache like that, everyone will think you're happy. But it's called The Laughing Cavalier. And in the Northern Europe at this point, there wasn't as much market for the church as a sponsor for paintings. So people had to look for others to buy their paintings. And in the case of Northern Europe, it was these newly rich merchants. And that was the market that these Dutch painters were looking at. And so this is a portrait, probably of a real person. And you can, in the style of Hals and Leicester and these Dutch artists, you have what is called a tronie. And this was paintings that aren't really depicting any specific person. It's just a painting of a type of person. So this one is just a youth with a skull. Simply a painting that, hey, I want to have a painting on my wall. And here's a painting of a boy singing with a flute.
Mr. Olson?
Yep.
I think people are in the waiting room.
There's one person in the waiting room, but I don't think it's a BFA person. So I'm just going to leave
What's their name?
Connect Live Group 3.
It might be Darren.
Yeah, because Darren said he's trying to get in, but oh, he's in.
Yep, so we'll see. As people come in, I'm letting them in if they have their real names. So we have these paintings here, good examples of what's going on in the Dutch Baroque, or actually he's Flemish. And with him was a lady by the name of Judith Leester, and she was trained by Hals. And this was her masterpiece, we would say nowadays. This is kind of her final exam to get into the professional guild. And she painted herself, just like Gentileschi, as a painter. And there's really very few women painters who made a name for themselves during this time. And she was one of the few that was actually able to successfully market herself and make a living. She actually married a painter, and she is the better of the two. And after she got married, she signed her paintings with her married name. And so for years, people attributed her paintings to her husband and didn't realize that they were made by her. And it wasn't until basically end of the 20th century when people began to realize, oh, these paintings were actually made by her. They weren't made by Hals or by her husband. And so she's been noticed as one of these people that is now an important Baroque artist in her own. And in this painting, it's quite the meta painting. You have here, she is painting one of these Dutch tronies, just a simple person with a violin, like this one, which she did later on, showing her painting a painting, but the concentration is on her self-portrait. And in it, again, she's holding a brush, she's holding her palette, but as opposed to the Gentileschi painting, she is not dressed for painting. She doesn't have her hair sort of loose. She's all done up, and there is probably very little chance that she would ever be able to paint with that highly fashionable lace collar on. It would turn one wrong turn and it scrapes against your painting that you're trying to make. So this is very much a posed sort of thing. And this is what she submitted to be allowed into the guild, which she was, one of the few women who actually make it into the Professional Painters Guild. So here's another example of her style. You have the strong lighting coming from up above, because his side of his face is in shadow. You have it possibly not necessarily a real person, just the idea. Another one in the Baroque style. And these type of paintings were all the rage during the 1600s. They were produced, they were sold, you could make a good living off them with these newly rich merchants. And then come 1800s, these fell very out of favor. And one of Hals's paintings, who is today, this is in the National Gallery, this is in the Wallace collection. One of his paintings was actually sold for the equivalent of about 35 euros at an auction. So kind of like garage sale level stuff. And then today, he's of course back in fashion. So I will just like to make a recommendation. If you get a chance to visit this museum in London, it's free. And it's got this cool painting and another one that we'll get to today. But it's also got one of the largest collections of swords and armor, which is really cool to go there and see. I am guessing probably close to 1,000 swords. That's what my guys were more interested in when we went there. All right, now we get to sort of the poster child of the Baroque, Peter Paul Rubens, and he is very Baroque. So he was a staunch Catholic, and he fully participated in this idea of let's make churches interesting. So he was up in Antwerp, which is today in Belgium, And this is today this is a Catholic area. And at the time of Rubens, it was going back and forth. It had been Calvinists, and the Calvinists, which are today's Presbyterians, were very much against any sort of decoration in the church. And so Rubens wanted to bring life and bring action back into the paintings in the church to give this message. And this is one we'll call the elevation of the cross. So this is when they're putting Jesus up on the cross. And this is an altarpiece. You can notice it's quite large. So I put this painting in so you can see how big it is. And we have here the cross being elevated, and Rubens is making a theological statement. So one of the things that was contested between the Protestants and the Catholics is that the Catholic Church said, when you take communion, the wine that you drink actually turns into the blood of Christ. And the bread that you eat actually turns into the body of Christ. And this is what we call transubstantiation. So Abiel is reconnecting. She needs to write Abiel as her name. And Rubens was fully in agreement with this idea of transubstantiation. And so he wanted to make Christ showing that he has weight, that he has substance. And you'll notice these guys here totally straining to lift Christ up. Christ's body is kind of sagging as it goes up here because he has this weight. You have all this pulling. And if we look at the composition of this, you have a diagonal. And compare this to Et in Arcadia Ego with all its sort of quiet and calming horizontals and verticals. This one, you have a lot of action, things happening. You have strenuous activity happening here. This guy pulling, this guy here. You have, just love the muscles on this fellow. The Romans, you know, let's go find a bodybuilder to help crucify people. And this is another similar work of his. This is the Descent from the Cross. And Rubens made two versions of this. And the first version was made for a guild. And I've lost my notes here. You can see which one exactly called. So it was the town guard. And their patron saint was Saint Christopher. And Christopher literally means Christ carrier or Christ bearer. Because the Catholic legend says that when Jesus was a kid, at one point he was at this river and he couldn't make it across. And so Saint Christopher picked him up and put Jesus on his shoulders and carried him across the river. And so Saint Christopher today is the patron saint of like travelers and people like that because he carried Christ. And if you'll notice, the people in this painting here are bearing Christ. And this is also a triptych, like this previous one. It has three parts. The main part is them taking him down, and is actually today, it's in the same church. So you can see both of them together. And on the one side, in the Descent from the Cross, it shows Mary visiting Elizabeth when Mary was pregnant. And on the other side, it shows Mary and Joseph at the temple dedicating Jesus, where they met Simeon, who had been waiting for the Messiah. And in this side, you have Mary, who is bearing Christ. And on this side, you have Simeon, who is also holding Christ in the picture. So all three of them are pictures of Christ bearers, Christopheros. And especially in this one, you have the Apostle John, you have Mary and Mary, you have Peter up here. And this is very Baroque in the sense of you have this strong diagonal, this motion coming down. And you have what you might say is unnecessary action. I mean, look at this guy here. He's climbed all the way up on a ladder just to then reach back down. And you have this dramatic looking, but my favorite, of course, is St. Peter. He's actually holding it in his teeth, which is, Baroque. You could say, if you see a painting and it looks just over the top, it's probably Baroque. A few more Rubens. So this is the Adoration of the Magi. And notice the structure you have here. So this guy, who is kind of the brightest figure, and he is pointing, guiding your eye toward Jesus. And then from him, you also have this sort of swirling thing moving up of the three wise men, and this fellow who has definitely not from a poor family. And they're looking in. You have these guys here clambering over, peeking around, very Baroque in its structure. You have lots of clothes. Look, for example, at this guy's, I guess, cloak, his security blanket. He's basically this large piece of clothing that is really only covering a shoulder and part of his arm. And you have lots of, this is sort of a Rubens taste, but he liked his people to be well, what should you say, to have lots of body on them. He liked his people fat. So this is a good Rubens type character. You have a good fat little chubby baby Jesus. Now, when you think of praying, and your classical painting, this probably you guys have all seen this before. It's in every Lutheran church in Minnesota. And this is your typical prayer idea. Old guy, quietly. This is so not Rubens. This is how you pray in Rubens. So Daniel in the lion's den. Hey, Daniel is not there just quietly saying, God, there's a couple lions. Don't make him eat me. No, he is twisted. His body is going like this. He is pleading. Notice that the clothes that Daniel has, it's not even on him at all, not just over an arm. So you have here the very Baroque idea. You have motion. You have this feeling of wanting to paint the time when things are happening the most. And so at this point, it's when Daniel is in threat of being eaten. You can see that, they do definitely eat people, but at this point, they're not. They're ignoring him. They're yawning, they're sleeping, and Daniel is deep in fervent prayer. All right, one of the most famous of the Renaissance or Baroque folks is Rembrandt. And this is one of the guys that we go by his first name. So his real name was Rembrandt Hermanszoon van Rijn. And if you're Dutch, you can tell me how badly I pronounce that. But he's from the Netherlands. And this is his first major work called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. And in the Netherlands at this time, as I mentioned a little bit before, you began to have this new class of wealthy people. Italy, Southern Europe was still dominated by the hereditary aristocrats, but in Northern Europe, you began now to have people who were making money on their own. And they were wanting to be patrons of the arts. And in this case, this is a group portrait. And instead of just like when you get together for a class picture, Mr. Bryan stacks you all in a room and says, okay, everybody in rows, take your picture. They wanted their portraits to show them doing what they're actually doing. And so this one in particular is the Surgeons Guild from Amsterdam. And so each of these people contributed to the payment of the money. And these generally, what Surgeons Guild would do is they would have a cadaver in the center. So here's another couple of ones that are done by people who weren't Rembrandt. And then you would just paint the faces of the people around, because this is how you learned. You had these group dissections. And of course, in their portraits, they would all be wearing their very best and finest. But notice these guys here, especially this painting here, they've all just sort of been stacked in rows. Of course, they have the cadaver there to show that they are surgeons. This one here, it's kind of like he almost cut and paste. He took a bunch of these faces and just stuck them onto stock bodies. So these two people are definitely not considered masters. Okay? Here you have the work of a master. You can compare it. You have the lighting, you have the three-dimensionalness, you have the fact that they look like they're actually going back. The faces are realistic, but they don't look like they've been photoshopped on. This is probably Rembrandt's most famous piece. And this was a thing commissioned for, it was a, oh, I don't have the name of the guild, but it was a militia guild. And this is again a group portrait. And we call it the Night Watch. This is the real name. And you can try that. But over time, the lacquer, the varnish that had been put over the top of the painting got darker and darker. And when you finish a painting, you basically put this clear lacquer over the front, over the top to protect it. And when you start, it's clear, you can see it fine. But over the years, it got so dark that people actually thought that it was a night scene, when it's not. It's not supposed to be necessarily at night. And they just recently painted, I should say, restored this. So today it's much brighter than it was just 10 years ago. But it got the name the Night Watch because it was such a dark painting. And what's interesting about this one is that, again, just like the Surgeons Guild, each of these people is a member of this Night Watch. And, oops. So here you have all of these different ones, but notice Rembrandt didn't paint them all equally visible. For example, this guy here, you can barely see him. Hey guys, you need to keep your microphones off or you get a lot of feedback. And so if you have a question, then you can turn it on briefly, but turn it back on again, off again afterwards. And here you have the two main characters. And interestingly enough, this lady here, who is holding a chicken, the symbol of one of the leaders was actually a chicken claw. So that's why the girl has a chicken, because it gives reference to one of these leaders. So this is how the painting originally looked. This is a copy that was made. And at some point, between when this copy was made and today, the original was actually trimmed. They cut this much off of the top and sides. So they actually cut these people out of it. But if you look at the composition of this one, it gives you a much better idea of what Rembrandt was intending, that you have these two verticals, bringing your vanishing point to right behind the center. You kind of lose that today where it's been trimmed down a bit. And here's another portrait of a military company. And you can compare this. This is actually done by Hals. And compare this then with Rembrandt in their different styles. In this one, everyone is shown fairly equally. These are the two leaders of it. But these guys are all relatively straightforward. In this one, you have much more creativity, much more background, things happening. And at the end, I will show you, I will include a link to a really cool video when they were restoring this, it was off display. It would be like the Mona Lisa were gone from France. And it was gone, I believe, for 4 years that it took to restore this. So when they put it back on display, the museum announced it by doing this flash mob thing in a mall. And so I will include a video of the announcement that the Night Watch is back in the museum that you guys can click on after the lecture. All right, and another very famous painting by Rembrandt, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And notice the chiaroscuro. You have the strong lighting. The center, the focus is actually on the father, not so much on the son. You can barely see the son's face, but here you have the father and his reaction. Even more than the prodigal son, you have the older son and his disapproval. And the message Rembrandt is bringing out in this one is kind of similar to what the actual message of the parable is. The parable is equally split between this guy and this guy. And Jesus was talking about these sort of people, those who were already Christians, if we use modern terminology, and their reaction to it, as much as he's talking about those who weren't. And here you have God accepting in these, and you have these people who the message of the parable, you could argue, was really directed toward. How are they going to react to this? And here you have Rembrandt showing him having to contemplate, what is God's mercy doing to this fellow over here? This one is located in the Hermitage, which is, I guess you could say it's the best museum in Russia. And I will admit that when I saw this painting, it was still the Soviet Union, and it was actually located near a window that the window was open and sunlight was actually falling on this painting. So I hope that they've rearranged things so that it's a little more protected from the elements than it was back then. And another interesting thing about Rembrandt is that he did a lot of self-portraits. So this one is him at 63. You'll just need to know it is self-portrait by Rembrandt. Don't worry about what year he did it. He did about 40 self-portraits. So, we're looking at like an average of one a year during his active painting life. And we can see him actually age. You can see him go through the good times and the bad times. And I like particular to look at his eyes here. And so you have this self-portrait, and this kind of shows what a master painter can do, and that you can actually show this care, this realism in the guy's eyes. You can picture that being your grandfather's eyes. Especially Rembrandt had gone through some really hard times. His wife that he really loved had died. He ended his life of a bunch of financial problems. At one point, he actually painted a self-portrait of himself wearing ridiculously fancy clothes. And at that point, when he painted that self-portrait, he was actually having to sell off his own furniture to stay from going bankrupt. So there's no way that he could have afforded the clothes that he was painting himself in. So this is a way that he, as the master painter, was able to really show the kind of the character behind the subject. We're just going to dip our toes into Spain. A guy by the name of Diego Velázquez. He was the court painter to the King of Spain. And one of his commissions was to paint a painting of the Pope. Again, we're back in Catholic countries. Spain is Catholic. And the Pope says, I'm an important person. I want you to paint a picture of me. And from what he's wearing, I'll have to do some research into this. He's probably still a cardinal when this is painted. But he said, you know what? I'm an important person. I don't have time to sit for you for hours. So you can come in, do the painting version of a little snapshot of me. I want it to be good. Of course, because I'm consider myself the most important person in the world. And, I'm going to pay you a lot of money for it. And so Velázquez said, ooh, this is a challenging thing. I'm going to have to practice. And so he had a slave named Juan de Perea. And so he said, you know what, I need to practice on you before I actually go do this on the Pope. And so he painted this portrait of his slave, who, interestingly enough, later became a relatively famous and pretty successful painter on his own. He was given his freedom about 4 years after this painting was made and continued to work with Velázquez and was a student of his. And so this was actually a study for this painting, because Velázquez wanted to practice having to do it on short notice, dealing with the difficult skin tones and such. And this is probably Velázquez's most famous painting. It's called Las Meninas, which means like the ladies in waiting. And so at first glance, it's a painting of the princess and her ladies in waiting who are there preening the little princess. And you have, oh, and then look over here, you've got a couple of dwarfs. Any good self-respecting court would have a couple of dwarfs in attendance. And then you, oh, well, yeah, over here you have this person who is painting. Oh, look, here's the back of a painting. So, oh, this guy must be painting a picture of me, who I'm standing here looking out at the princess, and he is painting my portrait. And who is the person painting? Can you tell who is getting a portrait? Here you have a mirror. It is actually a portrait of the king and queen. And so the king and queen are standing here, and their daughter is there. Oh, look, mom and dad are getting their picture taken. And then in the background here, you have one of the guys who is responsible for arranging, was sort of like your butler would be to the prime minister, I guess would be a better word. And then you have Velázquez over here, who is actually a fairly good friend of the king. And he is then painting a self-portrait of himself, painting a portrait of the king and queen. And so you have the king and queen standing here, Velázquez, who has actually painted a self-portrait of himself, and the infanta and her ladies in waiting. And it's kind of hard to see on the PowerPoint, but he is wearing this little red cross on his tunic, which is kind of, in that time, was equivalent to being a knight. And story goes that the king was so impressed by Velázquez's work that later he went back to this painting and he painted the cross to show that Velázquez had become a knight on the painting himself. Yeah, if you see that in real life, it looks like that cross is done quite professionally. So I'm not sure about that story, but it's a good one. All right, one of my absolute favorite Dutch painters is Johannes, or sometimes called Jan Vermeer. And he is somewhat of a mysterious figure. We don't really know much about him. He didn't leave us very many paintings at all, but the ones he did leave are quite elaborate and very technically accomplished. So this is The Astronomer. It's actually a relatively smallish painting compared to some of these massive ones that we've seen. And again, we're back up in the Netherlands. We're not painting rich and powerful people. We're painting businessmen. We're painting scientists. And this model here is probably based on the fellow who invented the microscope, a guy by the name of Van Leeuwenhoek, who lived in the same area and had some associations with Vermeer. So this is probably a portrait of Van Leeuwenhoek as an astronomer. And there are just filled with details. So this painting here, for example, and the map here, and the books here, all have meanings, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into right now, but come and talk to me over lunch sometime and we'll go into this and we can actually talk face to face again. But a few details I'd like to bring out is the book that he's looking at is this Institutions Astronomiae et Geographicae by that fellow, second edition, 1621. We can tell exactly what book it was. and it's actually open to a page where he is talking about how those who want to do astronomy and geography need to realize their indebtedness to God and such like that. We can tell exactly what model of globe. This is a globe of the stars that he's looking at. And we have an astrolabe, which was invented in the Islamic world, but it was adopted into the navigation world all through the West. Here we have the accompanying one, the geographer. It's the same model, probably van Leeuwenhoek, but you have a different globe, part of the same series, but now it's a terrestrial globe. You have him on a map. You have him with the compasses. You have a different map on the back. You have this chair, which we actually have about 4 or 5 copies of that chair in existence today. And interestingly enough, if you look up here, almost hidden is a device for measuring latitude. So you can see it here, and here he has painted it into the corner. And here we have one of these chairs that Vermeer has actually painted in as well. And if we look at Vermeer's paintings, a common theme is that he will have this strong light, or a strong light source, putting diffused light into the room from the left. You often have a leaded glass window on the side. You have very precise perspective. And one of the things that people have said is that Vermeer probably used a camera obscura, which simply means dark chamber. And this is something that's been, people have known about it for years. It can happen accidentally. If you have a dark room and there's just a little hole in it, so let's say you have rouladen in your window and it's almost closed but not quite, it can actually project an image of the outside world onto the wall. It turns it upside down, but this has been known about since, for sure, since the Middle Ages, possibly since antiquity. Here's an example. This is in Prague. There was a crack in one of the tiles in this attic of this building, and you can actually see the building across the street projected onto the wall, just through this crack in a tile. And there's been a lot of people who say, yep, Vermeer most likely used a camera obscura to trace out his images. Now, you wouldn't necessarily paint like color by number, but you would use this to then trace out the perspective so you get the proper angles on everything. So if we go back to, he would use it to paint out how the light fell, how the shadows, where people would actually be. Here's a great painting of his, View of Delft. And notice the detail. We only have around 40-ish. I think I have written down exactly. Nope, I don't have the exact number, but it was around 40 paintings that he did that we know of. Only about 3 paintings a year, which also supports the idea that he was using a camera obscura, that it would be a very time-consuming process. Here's another very typical Vermeer. He's only actually become popular in the last 50 years or so. And until then, he was just your random Dutch painter, but people have begun to realize just how skilled he really was. Okay, so here is his allegory of the art of painting. And so the model back here is actually following the rules in that Renaissance book that we talked about of the allegory of history. You got the little leaf, she's got the trombone, she's got the book. And so he is then painting the allegory of history, but he is then serving as the allegory of painting. But notice how he constructed this. And we can, again, go into, we know exactly what map this is. There's significance to that map. We can tell what book this is and how the pages is open. I have an art appreciation class that I will put in an unashamed ad for, that you guys should come out, and we will like spend a unit on Vermeer looking at why he painted, why he hung maps upside down in some, for example, things like that. Okay, this is possibly at the moment his most famous painting, Girl with a Pearl Earring. And there's debate whether or not this is a real person. He probably used a model, but again, this is not meant to be a portrait. This is just meant to be a girl wearing a somewhat exotic, this is definitely not a Dutch clothes. It's sort of an Asian inspired Middle Eastern turban. And draw some attention here to the pearl earring. Notice there's no connection to her ear. So there's not actually a hook. They did some renovation, some cleaning on this painting just recently, and they've said, yep, there's absolutely no connection here. This is actually probably more like polished tin than a pearl. It's way too big to be a pearl, and it's kind of the wrong color. And they've discovered that there's actually a green curtain behind her. But this would be Vermeer's most famous painting. And there's a great video about this one. Maybe I'll just include several videos that you guys can watch in your spare time, since I'm not necessarily giving you any homework other than to memorize Baroque paintings. So we'll end with that, and tomorrow we'll hit a little bit of architecture, we'll do the Rococo, and then we will look at Baroque, medieval, and Renaissance music just briefly. All right, so that is the end of